So, not how many people are trained, but what quality and what use they are making in the progress of their respective regions. So now stage is set for the three eminent discussants, and they would also be getting 8 minutes each. We would have first and foremost my very dear friend from Zimbabwe, Fanwell, who is very well known in the realm of assessment. He has been providing a lot of very active inputs, Fanwell. So once again, warm welcome to our process of taking South-South cooperation template forward. We have already a caveat yesterday, which I have been highlighting since morning, that came from the Global Development Network's President Pierre, and also from our very dear friend Professor Gladys, in terms of where we need to see the unique features of South-South cooperation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me start by saying that coming from Africa and coming from one of those countries that is a recipient of both South-South cooperation and North-South cooperation, if you want to call it, sometimes you are caught in the middle, where sometimes I get the questions, who is better? Why are you going to China and not the US? And my answer is, there's no one who is better, and there's no one who is bad. The best we can do is get the best out of both and avoid the worst out of both. And I think if we do that, we're going to win. Now, in that sense, one of the major issues that we faced on the continent is the challenge of measuring South-South cooperation. Now, the problem is that over 50 years of North-South cooperation, when we talk about South-South cooperation, everyone wants us to measure South-South cooperation using the same template. And if you are going to measure the same using the same template, then you are going to compare a good beer versus a good drink, soft drink. One has to be sweeter, one has to be bitter. A good beer has to be bitter. But if you use the measurement for a good beer on a soft drink, you say it's bad because it's going to be sour. Now, if you do that, you have a problem. And the differences come from the history. So one of the things we need to do is first is to understand the major differences between the two levels of, the two types of aid or help. So one, I always remind people, and it's important that when we do this, we look at the different features. There are three things I want to highlight that are different. South-South cooperation is not just public money transfer like ODA. Therefore, you can't measure it the same way. The second thing is that the actual development elements of South-South cooperation that can be comparable to North-South cooperation is a very small amount. If you look at only the financial area, the figures, the numbers, you actually think that South-South cooperation is not as important. But there is another bigger element that you can't then measure using the same template. The third area is that you need to look at the element of South-South cooperation. It is a complement. It is not a competitor. It is not a substitute. Now, if you measure them as competitors, then you are going to have a different outcome. The fourth element that I need to bring forward for us to think about is the history. Remember that ODA, no matter what has happened, is still mirrored in the colonial legacy. And that's why Britain or the UK gives the biggest aid to its former colonies, irrespective of what the developmental indicators are. That's why the US still gives a lot of its money to its countries that they think are strategically important for their foreign policy. That's why West Africa, France is the biggest ODA provider. So there is still a colonial legacy that hasn't really changed. Now, look at South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation is actually the opposite. It was the rebellion of the colonial ties. Now, you can't measure something that continues the colonial measurement and then something that is actually the opposite, that came as an opposite of that using the same template. So it's important for us to understand those differences at the beginning. Now, having said that, does it mean that we cannot measure South-South cooperation? The answer is we should measure it. And it's very important for us to find ways in which we should actually do that. So I have been involved in a number of meetings with the network of southern think tanks on developing indicators. And I think, Saia, here we have done a good work. We have a template that has been used to do some sample studies. It's a framework for M1D. But I'm not going to talk about the details, because that big thing has 5 areas that you can measure, and we can debate about the indicators. But those 5 areas are inclusive national ownership, horizontality, self-reliance and sustainability, accountability and transparency, and development efficiency. And that framework has over 20 indicators. Now, in our view, we are saying, should we measure all those 20 indicators? The answer is no, because of the plurality. So the point is that if your South-South cooperation is basically on one area, then you can look at what are the indicators in that area that actually you can actually measure. But there are certain things that are very clear. Transparency and accountability can never be forgotten, no matter what the modalities are. And in order for us to actually think about this in a very easier way, I have divided that whatever measures we come up with can be at 2 levels. And each one of those levels can actually have 3 indicators. And how those indicators can actually go about is something else we can debate. But the first layer could actually be 3 questions you can ask yourself, and then develop indicators. 1, is this on brief? Is this exactly what we said we are going to do? That's the first one. Is it on budget? And the third one is it on time? Those are very simple. No matter what type of cooperation you have, you can actually have that. And that is the first layer. And that is what others have called the process. How did we get there? The other layer that becomes very important is the second layer. And that also looks at kind of some outcomes that Professor has actually talked about. So the question is, how good was the process? How did we perform in whatever we set ourselves to do? And then finally we can say, what was the product of what we set ourselves to do? And in each one of these we can actually get some important indicators. And it's important for us to understand that when some of us argue that we cannot use the same template as the OECD, we are not saying that we should not measure South-South cooperation, or we should not assess the outcomes of South-South cooperation. But our fear is that, remember, the OECD, which is trying to have a template that everyone else should follow, has a history. And not all members of South-South cooperation or all providers of South-South cooperation are actually members of OECD. And OECD has its own uses and has its own roles. Now, I'm going to finally finalize this by actually saying, even though we talk about South-South cooperation, saying that it is not as measurable as the other ODA, we should also not forget the objectives of why the actual support comes. And I'm going to finish with 3 quotes. I have 40 seconds. I'm going to finish with probably 2 quotes. On 28 September 2018, somebody said, "We are only going to give aid to those who respect us and frankly are our friends." He went on to say, "We reject the ideology of globalization and embrace the doctrine of patriotism. The XX is the world's largest giver," I'm not going to mention the country, "in the world by far, of foreign aid. But few people give us anything." That tells you that even the famous ODA is not given on the basis of what it is going to do to the recipient. It is given on the basis of what is going to benefit the giver. And that's why, finally, Donald Trump said that at the UN General Assembly in 2018. Thank you.
Thanks, Fanwell. Thanks for reminding us of the red lines and also the way you look at assessment. Now I have great pleasure in inviting Dr. Pelani, the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Dialogue in South Africa.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this particular panel. I'm glad that I come just after Fanwell was speaking and comparing about beer. But it's a bit too early for that. Although I am tempted, I must say. You know, what I liked about this discussion is the fact that I think if the research community and the policymakers from the South are not driving this agenda and are not driving this idea of assessment templates, norms, and the plurality, I think then what happens is that we will be overwhelmed with the pressure that comes, you know, from other stakeholders who have actually gone and developed, you know, their own templates and so forth on M&E, and it's important that it's the research community from the South that is actually leading these processes. Otherwise, as I say, you'll find yourself, I think, knowingly or unknowingly actually adopting certain templates that might not best represent your particular form of South-South cooperation. And I think what's important here is that when we look at South-South cooperation and we look at North-South cooperation, is that firstly, we expect countries from the North to meet, you know, their obligations. For instance, development assistance, development cooperation. There is an expectation that they must actually provide to countries, you know, that are needy, to countries that have less resources than them. There isn't an explicit expectation that countries of the South must provide development cooperation or various forms of South-South cooperation. It's not an obligation. So the element of solidarity obviously comes in quite strongly there. And I think when you look at countries from the South, even in fact more so for countries for the South, they face the pressure of having to explain to their domestic populations why they actually are engaged in South-South cooperation. So there is an added pressure from them because of internal challenges that they continue to face. And with that in mind, it's therefore, I think, you know, quite important that where these discussions about quantity, about quality and so forth comes in. Because to some countries from the South, it's not in their interest to say this is how much we are providing to the rest of the world, because then their populations might say, hey, why aren't you providing that domestically? Why aren't you channeling those resources within the domestic landscape? So that's an important element, and I think, and an added pressure. But it certainly doesn't mean that these countries mustn't come up with their own systems. In fact, many of them already do have their systems. I mean, you take even the example of a country like South Africa, which doesn't yet have a, you know, let's say an official definition of its development cooperation, yet it has an African Renaissance Fund which provides cooperation within the African continent. It also has various processes underway, reform processes in actually coming up with the South African Development Partnership Agency. So though it realizes, yes, that it has to organize itself. But I think what we certainly need to, I think, acknowledge is that even though there are differences amongst the different countries, and there is a plurality, I think we can still come up with certain areas where you can actually classify you know, the modalities and actually go further in actually operationalizing some of these modalities. For instance, concessionality is important in the various activities that countries of the South are involved in. They all, to a certain extent, provide some form of grants. They all, to a certain extent, provide interest-free loans. They all, to a certain extent, provide humanitarian assistance. In varying levels, you have various volunteer programs, you know, that countries of the South are engaged in. You have the technical cooperation that countries of the South are actually involved in. And you also have other concessional loans that countries of the South are engaged in. Now, what are some of the non-concessional activities they're involved in? Well, most of them have various forms of commercial lines of credit. And there we need to, we need to draw distinctions, for instance, as to when we are operationalizing the South-South cooperation, which are the loans, for instance, that are explicitly subsidized by the various governments, and which ones are not. So where there is an element of concessionality, an explicit element of concessionality, I think there, you know, we can actually include it as part of South-South cooperation. For instance, we're here in India, and we know we've been hearing about the loans that are granted by the Export and Import Bank of India. But even when looking within those particular loans, there's a separation even there. So you have those that are explicitly subsidized by the government of India. And you also have those that are on a more commercial, you know, basis, where it's clear that, yes, there is a commercial element. But at the same time, I think with this understanding of mutual benefit, it's clear that if you have, let's say, the concessionality element, it doesn't necessarily negate the fact that the providing country also has its interests in the country that is actually a recipient. So I think we already have, you know, certain parameters of actually separating the type of South-South cooperation that is explicitly has an element of concessionality and solidarity, and that which is largely, interest driven from the provider country. And from that, we can actually separate elements of South-South cooperation and what we could consider as just, you know, what was said earlier, normal elements of trade, which might be interest-driven and so forth. So I think that already gives us something to actually work with. And I think then just lastly was also the element of quality. And this is going to be a challenge because, I mean, for instance, in the South African landscape, sometimes we hear, you know, we follow visits, for instance, to China by certain, you know, ministries and so forth. And one question that always comes out afterwards is, what did you learn? You're always sending people to China, to India, and to other countries. And yes, it's appreciated. But have you learned anything from that? And what has been the impact? Have you actually come back into the country and implemented policies and programs, you know, that either draw explicitly from those countries, you know, or are you just going there and, you know, on a holiday and then coming back? So the element of quality is going to be very important moving forward. And I think, you know, if this platform helps us to basically move forward in that regard, then I think we would have actually made quite a good contribution 40 years after the first BAPA meeting. Let me leave it there.
Thanks, Pilani. Thanks for highlighting the points that you feel are important when we talk about modalities and their measurement and the indicators. So now I turn to our representative partner from FIDC, Kaustubh Bandyopadhyay. He's director of the Society for Participatory Research in Asia. He's based in New Delhi, and PRIA is a well-known organization.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's a terrific privilege to be here in this morning, and I think this is one of the most relevant discussions that we are having at this point when we are trying to sort of, come up with a template for assessing South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation. But I may have to disappoint Professor Chaturvedi in terms of what I'm going to propose. And if you see my title, I suggested that 5 principles that should inform the assessment template, norms, and plurality in South-South cooperation. And initially, you talked about the principles. In the beginning, you talked about the principles. And therefore, I suggest a re-engineering of the title of this session. Start with plurality, think about norms and principles, and that should inform what template we have. And again, it's not a template, it should be templates. And that's the plurality that needs to be acknowledged. Having said this, the 5 principles that I'm going to talk about, I think elements have been spoken about here. First of all, let me go to the second slide in order to come back to the first slide. Some of the characteristics that we must acknowledge here about the South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, that most of the development cooperation under South-South cooperation is in a way instrumentalized through projects. And second is that there considerable heterogeneity in terms of actors and providers, activities and modalities used. That has also been talked about. But what may require an underlining is a key component of these modalities is the knowledge and experience sharing. And we have also talked about that there is no agreed upon definition of what is South-South cooperation, what is triangular cooperation. Each actor has defined in a slightly different way. So keeping these characteristics in mind, I suggest 5 principles. The first principle is there is a need for transition from a project-based approach to a program-based approach. And this program-based approach must be embedded in a robust theory of change. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that. Second is the measuring the effectiveness of multi-stakeholder partnership based on horizontality. And I'm carefully using the word effectiveness here because it is one of the most abusive word in the monitoring and evaluation world. And the third principles that I'm going to suggest is measuring capacity development as impact. So when you say, what kind of impact are you going to measure? I suggest that let's focus on the capacity building. And the fourth principle that I'm going to talk about is emphasizing on learning and accountability, and perfectly in that order, not the other way around, not accountability and learning, first learning and then accountability. And the fifth principle that I am going to talk about is giving premium to the participatory approaches, and therefore including community-based monitoring and evaluation system in the overall thinking of monitoring and evaluation of South-South cooperation. So let me spend a little bit of time on the first principle, where what is the benefit of having a theory of change and a robust theory of change? It will help us to move away from the linear and rigidity model of the OECD DAX suggested, which we often use, logical framework analysis. Those who have been practicing logical framework analysis based monitoring and evaluation, they have seen the frustration around that rigidity. It can also accommodate multiple pathways to reach the development goal. and provides much needed scope for the midterm correction. So it's not a single pathway, but there are multiple pathways to reach to the development goal, and acknowledging those multiple paths and applying that in the practical context. And the last point that should be taken into account is the complexity of the environment and the ecosystem in which the South-South cooperation projects and programs are implemented. The second is the effectiveness of the partnership. And some of the sort of indicators that we could think about an effective partnership is a collective diagnosis of the problem and the possible solution of goals. There is a discourse on demand-driven approach, but the demand-driven approach needs to be based on a dialogue. And therefore, this collective diagnosis is important. The second is the commitment from each partner to the solution and collective value added as understood to the complementarity. So the partnership is not to be understood at more of the same, but what kind of particular value each partner brings in the venture. The next point is to extent to which the partner contributes according to his existing capacities for the achievement of the collective goal. And these performance results achieved through this partnership. So it's not only about the partnership process, but also the results achieved through this partnership, and which sort of in a way endorse the point raised by Professor Lee. And having experienced this partnership, what is the level of satisfaction and the increased sense of solidarity? And there is a need and an urgency to come together and solve this problem. So that's my second principle. The third area is measuring capacity development as impact. I'm extremely delighted to see the list of indicators that Professor Chakrabarty has presented. But I'm afraid that the capacity building or capacity development needs to be understood in a slightly broader way. So it's not only the capacity building of individuals, but there are three interrelated layers to it. One is individual, institutions, and society. And these three needs to come together. And what we see here is a kind of output-driven, individual-oriented indicators, but it has to go beyond, because all the capacity building practitioners should experience the same thing, that you train people, but when they go back to their institution, the institution does not provide a favorable environment where this new learning can be applied. So learning becomes a frustration as opposed to moving forward and advancing new practices. So therefore, taking into this institution is very important. And once this institution, because these institutions are embedded in the society, the combined effect of individual and institutional capacities would contribute to the enhancement of capacities at the society level. But there are certain principles which need to be taken into consideration. One is that capacity development is a continuous process. It's not a project. It's not a project, and new capacities are built upon the existing capacities. And therefore, an assessment of the existing capacities and that demand for new capacities must be understood properly. The second point is the capacities are developed through multiple approaches. So it's not only training, there are a variety of ways capacities are built. And therefore, it will be a futile exercise to go for a cause and effect relationship. But some kind of association that this kind of inputs have produced a variety of outcome. That should be the approach. Then third is the capacity development. Professor Chaturvedi has talked about the endogenous nature of this capacity building. Who defines capacity building and whose capacity building? That needs to be an endogenous process. And learning and its utilization by the primary stakeholder is critical. And the last point is the capacity development of multiple stakeholders. It's often one stakeholder is targeted for capacity building. It's the community who needs capacity, or it's the particular officials, department, but we need to think in a systematic way and in a system-wide fashion, and therefore all stakeholders require certain amount of capacity building. And the point on learning and accountability, I mean, it has been a frustrating experience to, so far in the last 40 years, where learning has become a victim in the pursuance of, accountability. Where sort of money and resource transfer is involved. When your release of the next check is dependent on your performance, their learning takes a backstage. So that's the frustration which we should avoid in South-South cooperation. And it's not an unidirectional, it has to be bidirectional. Both the provider and the partner countries should be mutually accountable and mutually be learning. So that's the point of principle. And the last point is the giving premium to the participatory approaches. And here it comes from an organization which I belong to, Society for Participatory Research in Asia. Those who believe in participatory research would acknowledge that people in the community can produce and utilize knowledge. And therefore, in the whole colonial history, the derecognized of the community knowledge, that needs to be reversed. And therefore, how communities' knowledge can be integrated into the monitoring and evaluation system, that's going to be one of the critical principles. Let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Costo, for bringing in the dimension that I expected, and community definitely is an important component. Now, friends, we have a couple of minutes for discussion. As I mentioned yesterday, after the valedictory today, we are also initiating a major program to bring in universities, and I'm sure our colleagues from universities might have seen what kind of debates are going on in this realm, which usually from the IR literature doesn't get adequate attention, and that's why your presence here would be of great significance in terms of carrying forward this idea, not only from the process of churning that leads to theorization, but also in terms of putting this in perspective when you are back in your classrooms. And that's the effort we are trying to do through think tanks and University Connect. We would discuss that later in the day. But now I open the floor for comments and suggestions. We would pick up first 5 hands, and then so I would pick up 7 hands in the beginning, and any lady we would give a preference. So I would immediately go to Ms. Omoto from JICA, and then I come back here. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the rich discussions. I was quite pleased to hear that some of the panelists mentioned about the importance of capturing outcomes. I mean, regardless of the differences between South-South and North-South cooperations, we are aiming at the same goal, achieving Agenda 2030. And we are struggling to make the positive change on the ground. And that needs to be captured, but that is very, very difficult. And our North donor has been struggling how we can really capture and incorporate lessons learned from that aspect to our operations. So that, I think, the learning between North-South cooperation and South-South cooperations can be very valuable, because we have been struggling and you are struggling, and there are a lot of lessons can be shared. So that is a very good point to start our knowledge sharing, learning, so that we can understand a bit more about each other, and we can really share the commonalities on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mato. I also saw Mario, and then Stefan, Commodore Watson, and Butch Montes. These hands I have seen. Okay, so I would come back. I would come back. Yeah.
I would like to contribute by sharing just a little experience that is summarized by a joke. I hope it will help. It's about 2 economists, and one of the 2 every 10 seconds claps the hand. And the other says, "But what are you doing?" "I'm keeping away the crocodile." And the other says, "But we are in Delhi, there are no crocodile." So it does work. I think that these mechanisms represent pretty well a part of my profession. We try every mechanism to keep the reality outside and not to be confronted with it. What we heard in many cases is that the major principle is accountability, but accountability in respect of the public opinion of the donors. It's not about the impact and the impact in terms of development. Very often we read effectiveness, but how do we define effectiveness? As compliance with the principle defined by the word of cooperation. In one case as in the other, what is lacking is the object, is development, is the people. I like very much the last intervention, on which I agree completely. What he suggests is that we have to give voice to the people that are the object of the intervention, and this doesn't come from principle defined by the donors. It comes from other mechanisms. And secondly, it recalls to us that we do not know what makes development successful. We presume to know. Therefore, if we don't create a mechanism of dialogue with the actor, then we are misleading. That's why I again agree totally with Lee Xiaoyun. We need to measure output and outcome. But at present, in the experience in particular of the North-South cooperation, this is not done. I conclude by saying, what is a meeting, for example, about gender in developing countries? Is a meeting where the different donor agencies are around the table and they discuss what is the best action that they can do without women of the South. This is a good example.
Thank you. Thanks, Mario. Stefan, and after Stefan, Butch Montes. So.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Very fantastic panel. We should even spend more time on this, and also good to see that so much progress is taking place. I mean, we had last year already a similar panel and other occasions, so it's really fascinating to see that this topic is moving. I have 3 quick points. The first one on this input, output, outcome, impact level, what Professor Li Xiaoyun, Mario, and others were addressing. I think in a way it's right that our main objective should be that we are looking at results or even better impact. At the same time, I would also say there's probably even a need also to measure input and output. So why not to make it one package? So that's my first comment. My second one is maybe also to be ahead of, let's say, other discussions, other international discussions. Why not to take the 17 SDGs with 169 indicators as a starting point? Those indicators are used by all partner countries, by all countries in the world. And if you just select those indicators most appropriate for what South-South cooperation is doing, I think that would be a big advantage, because this is already measured, or it should be measured in all countries. So no additional, workload for institutions, etc., etc. And I would say, looking at other international institutions trying to do similar things, you would be really ahead of the discussion, to put it this way. My last point, this is also something what I'm quite often thinking. If you do capacity building in any area, teacher training, is it really that important? Is that different if you do it at home from when you are doing it abroad? So my question, why not to apply more of those analytical frameworks from at home, from India, from China, from other countries, and to think about how is it done in the context of domestic discussions in South-South cooperation providing countries. So those are my
Thank you,
small
Stefan.
comments. Thank you.
Butch Montes.
Thank you. It's a very great panel, yeah. And I'd like the last session too much. The way you interpret all the interventions is that, Sachin said in the very beginning that we need to rethink development policy, right? I'm not sure that the principles right now, even though I don't have any objections to them, reflect a rethinking of development policy, or what is needed actually for development. So the first request is that, is it possible for all of the PowerPoints to be shared, right? At some point, Sachin, right? Okay.
Definitely,
Okay.
definitely.
And then two things. One is one reason why a lot of, for example, just to talk about neoliberal economics, right? The dominant economics that we know, right? One reason why it has been failing is that it actually does not provide the supply capacity of developing countries, right? When you liberalize trade, and actually under OECD principles, and that's why I found very good. I mean, this is capacity building brought to another level, right? You liberalize trade according to the OECD. The lowest tariffs are the best. I mean, we walk into a very bad terminology, and we say we want the best practice, but what we want is successful practice, right? And for OECD uses, the best practice means the lowest tariffs are the best, right? And this is the kind of thing that you will need for things like common but differentiated responsibilities, etc.
Yep.
And one final comment about capacity building. I mean about participatory issues, right? You have to be careful about that, because old people like me remember the time during the structural adjustment programs that all of a sudden the IMF and the World Bank learned that we have to consult civil society, right?
Yeah.
So they would consult civil society without consulting the parliament, right? So, I mean, we have to respect and recognize the existing political system, right? In this kind of participatory issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Bushmontes. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
The mic is coming. Yeah.
Thank you, Sachin,
Yeah.
and I congratulate you for this panel. It has been very interesting, and as Stefan mentioned, I congratulate you as well for the advancement since 2013 from Delhi One. I think a lot of steps has been done in this direction, and since 2015, we all have worked intensively in this topic about the assessment of South-South cooperation. So you have mentioned that plurality is important, and one framework is not going to come, but a minimum is feasible. So I think maybe it's a good moment to link more close NEST, United Nations system, and developing agencies to work together, maybe in this minimum, I don't know if called template or something, because we have witnessing for the other side. I mean, it's okay that every country has their own metric, but we have witnessing maybe a fragmentation or proliferation of proposals from governments, from academia, for civil society. Very nice exercises. However, I think there is a lot of effort and resources there that might converge eventually to something more useful for the global community. I have remarked in other occasions the example of Iberoamerica with CEGIF, that they have, even if every Latin America country has their own metric and their own systems, at regional level, they account with one system or with one proposal. So maybe in Asia, eventually can happen. And finally, if in your proposal are considering a particular concept of South-South cooperation, because I think it's needed, as someone mentioned that.
Thank you, Commodore Wilson.
Good morning. I think I agree with all of us. That's been one of the best panels that's addressing the core issues. But also compliment Professor Chakrabarty and also Bandyopadhyay for the way ahead, which can shape from the discussions that have taken place today. A few points, a few observations, if I may. While these table 1 to 6 that Professor Chakrabarty has brought out are very important, they themselves need to be refined based on the inputs, mainly from the recipient nations, and not so from the people who are giving money, but more from the perception of people who are receiving this money. What is it they are using for? How are they doing it? And in what kind of agreement it's been done? And while on, again, I think must thank Mr. Fanwell for, in his final comments, he said, why there are expectations from the donors on what they expect the people to do. There are no free lunches. So this is on the idea of no free lunches. And also on paper, many of us try to say it's a win-win situation for both. But on many of the cases which are there, I'll quote 1 or 2, it's been a case for win-win for only the donor nation. So I might take the liberty of saying, since we have a Chinese representative here on the Maritime Silk Road and the BRI, Hampantota, you are talking about sovereignty in one of the tables, but for 99 years, that nearly 3 generations, the generations will not even know that it belonged to Sri Lanka. So, this cannot be a benign nature of investment. So I know the MSR and BRI has got the pluses and minuses, and China being a big country that it is, would have looked at this to apply self-corrections. But unless we look at this and to avoid the political, strategic, economic agendas of the donor nations, I think then only can we make progress and success.
Thank you, Commodore. Professor Mustafizur Rahman.
Thank you, Sachin, for your initial very insightful comments and also the panel. I have one observation and one question. My observation is that the issue of solidarity was mentioned, but I think we will also have to appreciate that there is a mutuality of interest when we talk about South-South cooperation, and there is a cost of non-cooperation. And I think that if we want to, ensure strengthen global integration of our economies, we will have to explore and exploit the advantages of production value chains and production networks, exploitation of the opportunities of common rivers, climate. So I think that is just not solidarity. I think that it is that we have common interests, and from there South-South cooperation comes, and it should be reflected in the outcomes and the outputs and the outcomes indicators as well. My question is that, you see, Kaustubh, you have mentioned very rightly, and others as well, that we are also talking in the context of the SDGs, particularly SDG 17, when we talk about South-South cooperation. So there is also a part of an obligation. I think that this shouldn't be just taken as a goodwill or good wish. So there is an obligation under Goal 17 that partnership will be put into practice in order to help those countries which are left behind.
Thank you.
So this is my
Dr. Hassan.
Yeah. And just the question is that no one should be left behind, the principle of the SDGs. So I think that in the outcomes that you mentioned, I think that is very, very important to reflect it, because we should not be trapped into averages. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
My concern is that we are talking about SDGs, goal number 17. Can we also see the role of SDG 16? Because that is very prominent, that is very needed nowadays, goal number 16. We experience on justice and interfaith. So is there any place we can put in the in our assessment process, and where we see the role of think tanks and civil society to promote all these things, if possible?
Thank you. Dr. Vinod Vyasalu.
Mr. Chairman, I've learned a great deal since 8:30 this morning. My thanks to the panel. I was very happy to see Milindo raise the question of conditionalities in his presentation. But I was a little disappointed that when it was broken up, it was limited to macroeconomic matters. I think this is a reaction to the Washington consensus and conditions like devaluation and deficit control. But I think there is also a case for acceptance of what I would call positive conditionalities. One example, India issued a tender for manufacture of solar equipment. And then the United States objected to a condition in that which said that some X% of the procurement must be from local sources, locally manufactured. This went to the WTO, and the WTO ruled in favor of the United States. When my friends in the civil service here who were working on the tender told me that they took this condition from some of the states in the United States which impose conditions when they invite investment into their own state. So the idea had come from there, but then in the way things worked out. So I think we should recognize that there is a place in South-South cooperation for positive conditionalities that have a long term. And this links to Bush-Montes' point very much.
Thank you. Ms. Carmen and then Bracho. Yeah, please.
Again, tremendous congratulations.
Can you bring it closer?
For a truly brilliant panel. My only regret is that it's a little gender imbalanced, but a brilliant, brilliant panel. Quick point. I think that, again, being a newbie to all of this, what strikes me is that we're dealing with many of the same issues, picking up on Noel's needing to explain to our publics the value of investing in cooperation is no longer just it's not a Southern issue, it's a global issue. We're having real trouble and I don't know if my JICA colleague would agree, but certainly there's, with the shifting global politic and Dr. Bokosi's comment, reading from one of the leading statesmen of the time, we really are we're in a different time. So explaining to our publics why to invest out when we have so many domestic issues internally. Quick point on triangular cooperation, being that as everyone is interest driven, whether it's north, south, east, west, we're all interest driven. And given that, triangular perhaps offers an opportunity where we are democratically on the same page. In other words, we are all coming and putting our issues on the table, ideally in a democratic way. So suggesting that there may be an opening there. Thank you again.
Thank you, Bracho.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I mean, from Delhi 1, we've been discussing one issue, and that's if we can get to a common definition of South-South cooperation. My point is that if after BAPA plus 40, we are not in a better position to finally arrive at what I think it's a very important issue, to bring to a common definition of South-South cooperation. Let me immediately say that the SDGs, the two of the indicators of the 17th goal, require this definition. And hearing the panel today, I'm a bit optimistic after 5 Delhi meetings. When I was hearing Professor Lee Ha-young, when he was saying that we have to limit the definition, that we are not in the 50s, we're not in the 60s where we can bring all trade and all investment as if it was South-South cooperation. We're hearing Filani, who was insisting on concessionality as a concept. And when also hearing Noel and Mexico has always given South-South cooperation from a concessionality point of view. So my point is, and of course, thinking that concessionality can be a concept that can bring in the compact definition of India. It can bring define trade and define investment with the concessionality component that will give us a difference between ODA and South-South cooperation, because I just remember you that ODA is only about flows, and the Compact of India is also about policies. So I wonder if with Chediek here, and with what we have advanced today in this panel and what we have been discussed, can we send the process, launch a process to start discussing after BAPA plus 40 the issue of definition? Can we get to a definition so we can actually comply with the SDG 17? We need that definition to comply with SDG 17, and I'm optimistic that we might get there soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bracho. Can we bring the mic here on this table? Yeah, yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful panel. You know, a lot of progress has been made, I noticed.
Can you bring it closer?
Okay, and my concern is very similar to Professor Lee's comments. It's still about the operationalize, how to operationalize these frameworks. And I'm wondering if you have tested your templates to different partnerships. And I know all these templates are initiated by academics, right? And how we can apply these templates to a nationwide assessment. And who should do this, you know? I know, like friends from Mexico, you're a government agency. If you do that, you know, it's very difficult to depoliticize your interest? Should we hire a third party to do this? How can we collect data from provider side or recipient side? And all these questions remain unanswered, I think. So I hope you can help me to figure out this, probably.
Very good. Thank you, Sharon. Can we go to Professor Hari Babu? And that's the last intervention.
Yeah, it's a very interesting session. Lots of issues are raised. One, I would like to comment on the measurement of output, right? See, measurement of output cannot be restricted to only quantifiable quantitative variables. We should also look at what this kind of cooperation did in qualitative terms, in terms of creating certain values, certain meanings, and also see what kind of changes have occurred in the quality of life. Because these are very extremely important for sustainability, right? So if a donor or somebody gives assistance and withdraws, after that what happens, right? So it's extremely important to build in this component also in measuring the output. The second thing I would like to mention is about the rules, right? A lot of discussion being taking place on rules. See, rules can be used to facilitate certain kind of action. Rules can be used to block certain actions, exclude people. Sometimes rules can be used to, keep some people out of a particular action. I think this should be kept in mind. That's why rules also always have to be evolved by discussing with the stakeholders, right? It can't be one-sided.
Thank you. Thanks. Except one or two, I think most of the interventions were more of observations, and I think they are going to enrich the work as my colleagues are going to undertake the assessment framework to its sort of rational conclusion when it is applied to cases, and as the concern came up whether these are being tested, so they would be responding. We are now left with 7-8 minutes, so I would request my panel to respond whatever ideas they are coming to their minds, maybe half a minute each. So Palani, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think let me just pick up on the point about accountability to who, the donor public or the recipients, where the development work is actually taking place. I think if South-South cooperation is demand-driven, therefore, if it's demand-driven, then assessment would have to go, the focus would have to obviously be on where the work is actually taking place. To understand also impact and so forth. But I think we also, because of the mutual interests also of South-South cooperation, there also has to be a look also from the side of the donor. And I mean, there's interesting discussions, for instance, in South Africa about assessing from Parliament, assessing the activities that South Africa is involved in on the African continent. And parliamentarians want to actually go out and go to where the work is taking place to get a better understanding of impact. And that's an interesting discussion that's actually taking place. So I think we can use both pressures, let's say looking where the development work is happening, but also use the pressure that's coming from the publics of the providing countries and the national parliaments, so that we're also assessing the mutuality of those interests. I'll leave it there.
Well,
thank you very much. I think the issue of accountability and the role that development plays and where it has to be is very important. I'll just give you an example of a scenario where there was an ambassador in one country who was saying they do what they do because they are accountable to their taxpayers. And one person asked the question, are you then accountable to the people you are giving money to? Can our parliament ask you to justify why you are putting money in certain areas because you are giving money for us? And that's a very important thing, because there was also another story that happened in one of the Southern African countries. It involved Chinese aid, where the Chinese brought in aid into a country, and they were so happy that this had been demand-driven. They came to the country, they found that the citizens were protesting against the same project that they had. And the question was, it was the president, not the people, who actually asked. To the Chinese, this was demand-driven. Demand-driven because the president represents the people. But on the ground, the president chose a project that suits him. That question is very difficult for us to actually today. Should it be the Chinese to actually ask the government and say, where did you get this project from? Would that not be non-interference? Should it be then the citizens making demands on their leaders about what they go and do outside? These are not very easy questions. I'll finally finish by saying, I think one of the most important things we should learn is that if it is difficult to measure, it doesn't mean that it is impossible to measure. It only means that we have to think hard about it. And the other thing is that we are so much obsessed with numbers. Let us remember that sometimes not everything can be quantifiable. And I've given this example a number of times. I know I love my wife, but I cannot give you a scale in a number of how much I love my wife. Thank you.